Hello, welcome. I'm Joanne Lasowski, author and journalism educator, and we're here to discuss issues of importance to the Caucasus. Today with me is Paul A. Goble, American analyst, writer, and columnist, and the writer of the daily blog Window on Eurasia since 2004. He's also the former advisor on Russian affairs to Secretary of State James Baker. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you. Good to be back.
So fragments of Russian Iskander missiles were found in the Shusha region, and that raises some serious questions. It appears Armenia was in possession of more sophisticated missiles than was once thought in the Second Karabakh War. What does that tell us about the Russian involvement?
Well, it tells us a number of things. First, it tells us, and I think this is something I wish people were paying more attention to, is the Russian weapons didn't do Armenia very much good. If they did have better weapons than people thought, the fact is it didn't keep them from losing the war. The second thing is that the Russians have been duplicitous in many ways about this conflict and other things as well. And I suspect that over time, Russian weapons were in fact given better weapons than Moscow has acknowledged to Armenian forces. I doubt that these were in fact used by Russian forces themselves. There's a problem that they exist, that Moscow is selling those weapons or giving those weapons to Armenia, but it's probably not the case, as some have suggested, that this meant that Russia was intervening on the Armenian side. If in fact that were true, it would mean that the Karabakh conflict was an even bigger defeat for Moscow than would otherwise be the case. But my own guess is that either Moscow decided or someone at the Gyumri Russian base in Armenia decided to give Armenia some of these more advanced weapons, that the Armenians used them, clearly not very effectively, and so one would expect to find remnants of that. Going further, identifying it further, would require that someone confess to something. There just simply aren't going to be enough pieces of any rocket left for us to tell whether this was used by Russians or used by Armenians.
So we'd need fingerprints, actually, or something.
And I think we aren't going to get those. I mean, my own sense is that had the Armenians had a large number of these weapons, we would have seen more of them. We would have seen them more places. The fact that we're seeing them only in Shusha, if I had to come up with a scenario, I would suggest that what happened was when it became obvious that the Armenians were really losing the war, that Azerbaijani forces not only had taken back all of the buffer zone between Karabakh and the rest of Azerbaijan, but had moved into what the Armenians refer to as, and the Russians refer to as, Nagorno-Karabakh, and that Armenia was losing. And in a situation like that, I can well imagine that some Russian commander decided to help the Armenians to prevent that from happening. That's why it was probably found in Shusha, because it was the fall of Shusha that ended the war. Once Shusha was taken, there was nothing to prevent an Azerbaijani strike to occupy Stepanakert. Had that happened, there would not be anything left of the Armenian Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh regime.
I understand that the use of these missiles is being investigated in Russia because they are saying, because of obligations, they of course would not have lent or given these kinds of missiles to Armenia during this time. Is it possible that these missiles were sold without the Kremlin knowing about it?
Well, it's entirely possible that, that Moscow says it's investigating something that it knows what it's done. is standard operating procedure. The Russian government routinely says it will investigate something that it knows exactly what happened. So the possibility is that someone in Moscow gave the order, or someone in the Gyumri base. It was clearly not a policy that was put in place long in advance. Otherwise, there would have been more of these missiles. The fact that there was one, that we found the remnants of one, and that we found it in Shusha, suggests to me that it was probably, I don't have any evidence for this, this is simply a logical chain, that someone in the Gyumri base, a Russian officer, decided that he didn't want to see Armenia lose completely. It was very close to that, and decided to give this kind of weapon to see if that would slow things down. How much Moscow was involved in that decision, I simply don't know. I think Russian command and control in the military is overrated, as in most things about Russia, and therefore I would not be surprised that someone farther down the chain of command did it either for money or for personal reasons. I just don't think that Moscow has that kind of control, much as it will insist otherwise.
Also about Russia, we understand there are an unusual number of Russian forces heading to the Ukrainian border, and ceasefire agreements are being violated. Some say the clock is ticking for a Russian military advance in that region. How do you see this?
Well, it is clearly the case that Moscow is putting in place the forces it would want to have in place if it's ready to invade, to deepen its invasion of Ukraine. It's not only putting troops along the border, but it has sent a series of ships from the Black Sea south through the English Channel, ultimately to go into the Black Sea, passing through the Straits, the Istanbul Straits, and then be in a position to have a military landing, a Normandy-style landing. It's been described by some Russian commentators further to the west. Yes, what we're seeing is a Russian move that raises the threat level. Why is this happening? Well, I think there are several reasons as to why it may be happening, and only one of those leads to the possibility of a real invasion. It's a testing. It's a way of testing not only where Ukraine is, but it's a way of testing what the West will actually do. The United States and several Western European countries have taken a pretty tough line, but it's one thing to say you'll stand with Ukraine. It's another thing to do it if it means committing military force or providing military equipment in the face of a Russian invasion when the Russian invader has nuclear weapons. The world is just that way. Second, it's a way of destabilizing Ukraine. Just simply putting that kind of force near the borders makes it more difficult for Ukraine to engage in the kind of modernization and anti-corruption efforts that it needs to. It simply becomes the only thing people can focus on. Why right now? I think two reasons. First, Mr. Putin is having a hard time at home. There are a lot of people who are upset with him. Things are not going well. The economy is not going well. Yes, Russia had the first anti-coronavirus vaccine, but it has done very, very much worse than many other countries in getting that vaccine into the arms of its own population, and more people are dying. The excess deaths that Russians talk about is a serious problem. Clearly, not to mention the Alexei Navalny affair, Mr. Putin would like to distract Russian attention. I'm not sure that will work, but that's what I think is clearly on his mind. The other is, let's remember the calendar. You don't go to war when you're going to do it on land in October or November. You do it in the early spring. You do it in April or May. And one of the best independent military analysts in Moscow says Moscow will be ready to move in a month.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about a military action exactly at the time you would expect. My guess is that if the United States and NATO demonstrate that they're really prepared to support Ukraine, and that means, in my mind, both providing offensive military capability, that is javelins, that is tank killers, and I think if you provided enough javelins, you probably would stop a Russian thrust pretty quickly. At least you would inflict so much loss that the Russian government would have a big problem explaining it all to its own population. I think if we do that, I would like to see us fast track Ukraine into NATO. I've said that since 2014. I think the Russians should be on notice that invading neighboring countries is wrong and that the international community isn't going to stand for it, and that Russia can huff and puff as much as it wants. It's important that Moscow be told that this will not be tolerated. I'm not suggesting that we bomb Moscow. Please understand, that's not what this is about. It's to make clear that you don't invade a neighboring country and that we have the capacity to help a neighboring country resist. That's the principle of the NATO alliance, and it should be something that we would extend to one of our partner countries, Ukraine.
So you mentioned this earlier about the crisis level, and the U.S.-European Command has raised its threat level from possible crisis to potential imminent crisis. That happened last week.
Right.
So it seems that the U.S. is really taking this seriously.
Well, it's one thing to take it seriously. I mean, this is like changing the fire danger alarm when you don't have rain in a forest area. Yes, we've raised that. Now, what are we going to do? I mean, I'm glad we've done that. It's a signal. But the question is, what do we actually do? Are there weapon systems being offloaded in Odessa and moved up and provided to the Ukrainian military? Because to be very honest, the Ukrainian military will need time to be able to use new weapon systems if they're given to them. And we're talking about, let's say, a month. If we accept the idea that Russia would be ready to move on May 1st, those weapon systems had better be getting there pretty quickly, or the Russians will see what we're doing in the West as huffing and puffing and not meaning very much, and will be only too pleased to do something to embarrass President Biden. And they have no reason to like now because of his recognition that Putin is a murderer. I think my own guess is that we will not see a wholesale Russian military thrust into Ukraine. The risks to Moscow are too great. What I also think, however, is that it is entirely possible that we will see a targeted military advance by the Russian army to try to take control of the watershed just north of Crimea. Crimea is running out of water. People are in real trouble, in dire trouble in terms of health. Agriculture is failing. And I believe that Mr. Putin, if he casts an invasion of that part of Ukraine as an effort to rescue in a humanitarian way the people of Crimea, there will be a lot of people in the West who will be reluctant to take a tougher stand against Moscow's move. So I think that's entirely possible, maybe even likely. I think a broader attack now would have consequences for Moscow that I think Mr. Putin doesn't want.
I think this leads to the next question I'm asking you, because it seems like Paris and Berlin are calling on both Russia and Ukraine to avoid the provocation. So it looks like the West is sort of, please stop both sides. they're not directly saying it's all entirely the Russian fault if anything breaks.
Well, the United States mercifully has been quite good about this and has suggested that the problem is in Moscow. The Europeans are trying to take an intermediate position and say both sides should avoid this. But I think, look, Ukraine is not an occupation of any part of Russia. Ukraine did not annex any part of Russia. Russia did both those things. It lied about what it did. It has military forces designed with an offensive capability, not only the tank armies in Crimea and east of the Donbass, but also military forces in the Donbass and military forces on these ships that are making their way from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, which could be used for landings in the Odessa region and elsewhere. I'm not surprised. The Europeans have been softer in general than the United States. I'm very pleased that the United States now, in contrast to the previous administration, recognizes that the problem is Russia and that Ukraine deserves full and complete Western support. How much of the West the United States can carry with it in that regard depends on just how much we think we need to do, and there will be certainly a big Russian effort to magnify differences between Europe and the United States on this, in the hopes that the division will undermine Ukrainian self-confidence and will allow the Russians to achieve more than they deserve.
So with this troop escalation, can the Kremlin maintain this veil of plausible deniability as it has in the past, blaming mercenaries and local collaborators?
Well, there are some people who'll believe anything, as unfortunately is demonstrated all the time. The Donbass didn't happen. The seizure of Crimea didn't happen because there were no Russian forces about. The fact that there are still some people, especially in Europe, who are somehow prepared to believe that this is a civil war because Vladimir Putin says so, says more about them than it does about reality. This is not a civil war. What this is an imperial land grab by Moscow against the Republic of Ukraine. And will Moscow be able to continue to insist otherwise? Of course it will continue to insist otherwise. It's shown no respect for the truth because it doesn't have to. It isn't called out on every and all occasions when it lies to its own people or to the West. I mean, the idea that there were no Russian forces in Crimea and that the vote of the Crimean people was in favor of Russia and it was a completely fair and free referendum is utter and complete nonsense. Is it widely believed by a lot of people? Absolutely. People believe lots of things that aren't true, and Vladimir Putin is counting on that continuing to be true.
Thank you, Paul. I have one more question on this subject. What about the Commonwealth of Independent States? With Ukraine's exit, does that mean the death of this organization, or was it really just a puppet organization?
Well, the Commonwealth of Independent States was created to do two contradictory things. On the one hand, it was to be a divorce court, to make it possible for the 12 republics to separate, because it's complicated. I mean, they are tied together by many things. Most people don't know, but Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which are now members of NATO and the European Union, still have officials sitting on the railway body that governs railway traffic on the territory of what used to be the USSR. So unpacking that is not easy. And indeed, Ukraine's exit that you mentioned has been ongoing for about 8 years. They've just recently denounced a couple more agreements, but there were several hundred of those agreements. And so what we're talking about is a slow motion. I'm going to come back to it. The other thing was that the CIS was something that was created to prevent the emergence of something that from Russia's point of view was even worse. And that was that it very much appeared in December of 1991 that there were going to be two centers of organization in the post-Soviet space. One was going to be a Slavic Union, and the other was going to be the Muslim republics of Central Asia plus Azerbaijan. There was a meeting in Central Asia to put a Muslim Republic alliance together. That so frightened Boris Yeltsin that he moved to get the Almaty agreement, which created the CIS. But beyond that, there was a hope that the CIS would be a carcass around which the empire could be rebuilt. I think the CIS was never something that could be long-term. One republic refused to join completely, Georgia, until the Western powers insisted that it join, lest we somehow offend Moscow. But Georgia left after 2008, after the Russians invaded that country. Ukraine has been in the process of leaving. What is striking and what should be remembered right now is that the last meeting of the CIS ministers last week, not only did no one from Ukraine show up, but there were no signs that anyone ever expected Ukraine to show up again. The flag was not there, the symbols were not there, the name tags were not there. Always before, Moscow had treated it as if the Ukrainians will show up, and worse. And this is something which, to be blunt, I'm quite surprised has not been widely reported in the United States. From 1992 to 2020, all meetings of the CIS, when they took place in Moscow, took place either in hotels or in foreign ministry-related buildings. This one didn't. This one took place in the same building that was used for Warsaw Pact meetings in Soviet times, the military alliance, sending a signal that from Moscow's point of view, the CIS is supposed to move in the direction of being a post-Warsaw Pact arrangement rather than being some kind of economic and political grouping. So is it dying? I thought it was stillborn. How to talk about this complicated part of the world. I wrote an article and gave a speech actually in '92 called Sis Boom Ba, which wasn't very popular in a lot of quarters. Even published an article with that title a couple of years after that. My own sense is that the CIS had an impossible task because it was internally inconsistent, and I think it is on its way to dying. I think the Ukrainians will never go back in. Georgia will never go back in. I believe that other countries will exit as well. But as the Ukrainian experience should have proved to everyone, the process of exiting isn't something you announce and it happens the next day. It takes a long time to unpack these relationships. And what is striking is that Moscow, instead of showing some hope that Ukraine might return, has now taken steps last week that shows that Moscow doesn't expect that ever to happen. As Big Brzezinski said, if a Soviet Union, a state based on Moscow without Ukraine could become a nation state. A state with Ukraine is an empire. Mm-hmm. Well, it's no longer going to be an empire, at least not of the dimensions that existed before.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. This has given us a lot of insights. We'll hopefully be talking to you again real soon about the elections coming up, both in Russia and Armenia.
Right.
But thank you for your time today, and we hope to see you again soon. Paul.
Thank you very much.